Last week, a 28-year-old American was charged with attending an al-Qaeda training camp in Somalia. Daniel Maldonado joined a growing list of Westerners who are embracing jihad. But as Eric Stackelbett reports, not all of these converts stay in the Islamic faith.
Americans were shocked back in 2001 when U.S. citizen John Walker Lind was captured by U.S. forces in Afghanistan. Lind, who was raised in an upper-middle-class California home, converted to Islam as a teen. Before long, he was fighting alongside the Taliban against U.S. troops. Today, he's serving a 20-year sentence in a federal prison in Colorado.
To what can we attribute?
Another California native, Adam Gadan, has spent the past several years as a spokesman for al-Qaeda. He now goes by the name Azam the American. Gadan, who's half Jewish, was raised on a goat farm. He was indicted in absentia for treason, the first American charged with treason since 1952. He's believed to be hiding in the mountains somewhere along the Pakistan-Afghanistan border. So what drives young men like Lind and Gadan, born and raised right here in the U.S., to embrace a movement committed to America's destruction? David Gartenstein Ross says it's easier than you might think. Born Jewish, he was raised in Oregon by hippie parents. His upbringing left him searching for spiritual answers, and after a Muslim friend introduced him to Islam in college, David converted. He ended up working for a radical Islamic charity. He tells that story in his new book, My Year Inside Radical Islam.
Well, David is here with us right now. It's a pleasure. Thank you for being with us.
It's a pleasure to join you.
You were a clerk in a United States Circuit Court, I believe, in Washington, weren't you?
I was indeed the federal appellate clerk.
But the FBI got the word that you had been playing footsie with a Islamic charity, a radical charity, apparently.
Well, to clerk on a court of appeals in the United States, you don't actually need to have a security clearance, but you do need to put in a routine background check form.
Okay.
So when before I went to clerk on the D.C. Circuit, when I was filling out this background check, one of the things I wrote down under previous employers was the Al-Haramain Islamic Foundation, which is both a terrorist group. The office that I worked for is today a specially designated global terrorist entity. And beyond that, they were in the process of investigating it at the time. So obviously, when I was clerking there, red flags went up.
That's second to the Supreme Court. I mean, it's the most powerful circuit in America. I mean, it's a really prestigious place for a young lawyer to get in.
Yeah, well, I got the clerkship prior to 9/11 when things like Wahhabi charities and terrorism weren't so much on people's radar screens. So it was, my clerkship, I was the first class of clerks right after 9/11. So to that extent, I think maybe if I'd been a little bit later with that previous employer, I might not have made it in.
Well, let's back up a little bit. Hippie parents in Oregon, commune, I suppose, Jewish, and you turned Muslim? How in the world did that happen?
Well, my parents are both Jewish by birth, but weren't really satisfied with traditional Judaism. I think the artwork they had up around the house is reflective of their brand of religion. We had pictures of Jesus up in the living room, a statue of Buddha in the backyard. My parents were kind of Unitarian Jews who esteemed Jesus and Buddha equally.
Unitarian, eclectic Jews.
But it was actually early debates with Christian friends that began to set me down the path toward Islam. I had a very good friend who would push me on the respect I was raised with for Jesus and advance C.S. Lewis's famous liar, lunatic, or Lord argument that he puts forward in his classic book, Mere Christianity, arguing that the one thing Jesus could not be was a good and wise spiritual teacher, because he claims to be divine in the New Testament. So the argument is that either he was telling the truth, or if he wasn't, then either he lied about something as important as the nature of God, or else he was so deluded into thinking he was divine but wasn't.
So that pushed you to Islam? That argument?
No, it seemed to me that Islam provided an answer, and one I was very comfortable with.
Well, look, you're a smart guy. You don't get to clerk on the D.C. Circuit with being a dummy. Weren't the claims of Muhammad a little bizarre to you? How did you buy into that thing?
Well, there are different ways of looking at the Islamic faith. And, I mean, in particular, when I was in college, my friend Al-Hussein Medhani, the man who taught me about Islam, put it forward as a very simple faith. When I worked for a Wahhabi charity later, they made it very complex and brought to life many of the more bizarre ahadith or sayings of Muhammad. But there are a lot of different practices of Islam, and a lot of the fringe practices that sometimes we see front and center here don't impact the lives of Muslims day to day on a way that one might think.
What about the role of women? I've heard that Muhammad said a woman is about the same as your donkey. I mean, didn't that upset you?
Well, I think one of the reasons I decided to write my book is to explain the process of radicalization that I went through inside the charity that I worked for. Because I think that the process by which people become radicalized within Islam isn't well known by Westerners. And with the global war on terror, it's a very important thing for people to understand.
How does it take place? I mean, you go in, you think, well, hey, this is a cool religion, and Jesus may be a fraud, and so I'm going to buy into Muhammad. Then how do you get radicalized? What do they do to you?
Well, for one thing, it wasn't that Jesus was a fraud; it was that his word was misinterpreted.
Well, I understand. Whatever.
And I mean, within the group I was working for, there was a process of a few different things. For one thing, there was peer pressure. For another, just complying with external norms, even small things like growing out my beard, changing the way I ate food, changing the way I related with women. But the most important thing was the process of intellectual persuasion. And one thing I hope people will understand is that a lot of times radical Islam can be viewed as this outlier like David Koresh, Jim Jones, but there are powerful arguments for it that can persuade people. Now, I think there are also powerful arguments for moderate Islam, and ultimately the debate between the two is going to have a tremendous effect on the course of world politics. But we need to understand how people do view the faith, because a lot of times in the West, we do not have a very realistic view.
What about the whole thought of jihad? When I was in college, 50-some years ago, we learned about jihad. I mean, it was, that was how they overran North Africa and were trying to take over Europe. And what's so surprising today about learning about that?
Well, I think, for one thing, people are very uncomfortable in general discussing religious concepts and dealing with them on their own merit. In terms of the concept of jihad, you have a lot of discussion about whether there are non-military meanings as well. When I was within Al-Haramain, I was persuaded by the militaristic definitions. The argument that a moderate Muslim would make is contextualizing the jihad verses, or contextualizing actions and placing them more in the political sphere as opposed to the sphere of religious obligations. Like I said, that's very important, but the concept of jihad is another concept which people just are uncomfortable discussing. And unless we understand how people like bin Laden and Zawahiri view this, we're not going to have a very good understanding of the enemy.
Well, what began to turn you away from this charity where you were working?
Well, I was scheduled to leave after a time because I was going to be going to law school. That was already scheduled. But if there's one thing that working for a radical Wahhabi charity can do for you, and accepting their beliefs can do for you, it's trigger a spiritual crisis. And ultimately, in the summer of 2000, after my first year of law school, I was very unhappy with where my faith had brought me. And that was when I really started to study religion a bit more to try to reconstruct my faith.
And then what happened?
Well, ultimately, and this is making a long story short, but ultimately I became a Christian, and I'm a practicing Christian today.
Well, when you went to the court, though, the FBI finally got hold of you and started questioning you, called you in for questioning. How did you persuade them that you weren't really one of the Wahhabis?
Well, I'd been a practicing Christian for a few years by then. And what they decided to do was orchestrate a fake security clearance check to basically to get my permission to vet me, and so it wouldn't raise any red flags for me. It was very non-intrusive. I was told that there'd be terrorism cases coming through the D.C. circuit, and so all clerks had to apply for clearance. And in doing the interviews, talking to friends, they were kind of able to get the story of my religious development. And ultimately, I think the time that they became convinced was a little bit later. I mean, ultimately, after the offices of Al-Haramain got raided, after it became obvious that the group I had worked for probably had a role in funding the Chechen Mujahideen, these holy warriors who were fighting the Russians, I volunteered for questioning and to help the investigation, because I thought that it was important to take kind of this bad place I had been and try to help something good come out of it.
Are you still working? I mean, you're identified as an informant of the FBI. Are you still working with the FBI as a consultant or something?
Yeah, I work in the counterterrorism field. I don't do, these days I don't do much work with the FBI specifically, but I do law enforcement training. I work with think tanks, and there's going to be some, probably I'll have some broader projects to do with this.
Al Haramain, is it still in extant, or did they close it down, raid it?
The Al Haramain office in Oregon that I worked for has been shut down, and the Saudis officially shut down the charity. Look, this charity is a group that had involvement in the 1998 East African embassy bombings. They have been a major al-Qaeda financier. They've had their hands in the chaos in Iraq, in Somalia, and but overall, the group, the structure is still in place from the reports that I'm hearing.
Well, you said they're funded by the Saudis. The Saudis control them. Is that what you said?
Yeah, Al Haramain was kind of a quasi-governmental organization.
Of the Saudis?
In Saudi Arabia.
That's shocking.
Well, and also, there are a number of people who were affiliated at high levels with Al Haramain, from Akil al-Akil, Solomon al-Bouteh, who had a direct relation to my